So I want to suggest this evening 4 keys to a happy marriage in a hostile world. 4 keys to a happy marriage in a hostile world. And some of you say, Pastor Johnson, my marriage is what's hostile. and maybe that is the case. But for sure, the context of 1 Peter is a hostile world. 2 Peter deals primarily with false prophets and addressing false prophets, but 1 Peter, and maybe you have been here when I have worked verse by verse through these 5 chapters here in 1 Peter, but 1 Peter is primarily dealing with Christians that are about to face martyrdom. It's a book about Christians facing suffering, and right in the midst of preparing the redeemed to face potential martyrdom is a charge to make sure you're conducting yourself well in your marriage role. It's interesting. And really, I think what the Holy Spirit and the human penman, the Apostle Peter, have in mind here is that there's no time for fussing and fighting in your marriage when the government of the day, Nero, and the world around you is attacking and martyring Christians. Another thing that's in view here is that a happy marriage or a harmonious marriage, a marriage that's centered on Christ, is a part of our evangelistic outreach. Like, we as married individuals should conduct ourselves in a way that represents well Christ and His bride. And I say that with Ephesians 5:21 and following in mind. And so, a happy marriage in a hostile world, and I have, as I've already explained, I have went verse by verse, phrase by phrase through this book, and so I will not do that this evening. I have done that, and I commend those sermons to your consideration if you would like me to do that. But what I want to do tonight is really do some counseling from the pulpit. I said in the beginning the title is 4 Keys to a Happy Marriage, so I want to give you some extremely practical things. I want to give you what I think are the 4 keys to a happy marriage in a hostile world. And by way of introduction, let me say this, that marriage is the most difficult thing that I've ever been a part of. And that is no reflection on my wife in specific. I wrote that in my notes and then I underlined it. And then I wrote, make sure you say that. But in all seriousness, marriage is the most difficult thing that I have ever done or been a part of. It is harder than raising children. It is harder, more difficult than pastoring a church. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it is also the thing that has brought me the most happiness in my life. And so if you are going to have a happy marriage in a hostile world, you need to consider these 4 things, and I give you the first one now. The first of 4 is to identify your enemies. If you want to have harmony, happiness in your marriage, you got to know who your enemies are. And some of you are like, yeah, I know exactly who my enemy is. I'm sitting next to them right now. That is my spouse. No, really, the enemies of the harmony of your marriage include the world and the flesh and the devil. If you are endeavoring to build a marriage that is God-honoring, that is established on the roles that our Creator God have prescribed in this blessed book, if you're trying to do right in your marriage, then I am telling you, you are swimming upstream in our culture. You're going against the grain, and as a result, the world and the flesh and the devil are aligned against you. And they are your enemies. And so let's kind of break some of these ideas down. How is the world the enemy of my marriage? Well, the ideologies of this wicked world. And as it increases in its wickedness, its ideologies are more obviously anti-God. The idea of feminism, which maybe in its inception had a few valid concerns, but in its fruition is completely pagan, and it is antithetical to the Bible's teaching about a woman's place. What the feminists are crying out for today, again, are very anti-God things. The ideologies of this world, including feminism, not only that, but our TVs, the media, often portray derelict husbands. The world's ideologies are only adding to the hostility, the potential hostility in individuals' marriage. Not only the world, but then the flesh. And if you've been married a little while, I don't have to tell you. You already know that your flesh is the enemy to the harmony of your marriage. I mean, pornography is a temptation not just for men, but increasingly it is for women. And that is a type of cheating on your spouse, certainly. It is a disloyal thing to engage in. And it's your flesh that cries out for that kind of thing. I was listening to an individual who is much my senior. I think he's 73 years old, at least at the time he was communicating this. And he and his wife have been married now 50 years. And he was talking about the mountains and valleys of marriage over 50 years. And he was extremely transparent. And kind of the way he said it, I found refreshing, which was that he kind of said it like, we've made it. Not in the sense of we've made it because they've still got years together, but in the sense of we've made it at least to this point. And included in his transparency was this recognition that the two of them, even at his age, that the two of them for those 50 years have had to fight their flesh. They've had to fight not only the ideologies of the world, but they've had to fight their flesh, endeavoring to find contentment in the gift that is honorable and undefiled, known as marriage. Pornography, it's something the flesh craves. Adultery, even as our flesh continues to rear its ugly head, pride is a manifestation of our flesh. I'm saying that your ego is the enemy of a healthy marriage. And that shapes up in all kinds of different ways. The passage here in 1 Peter chapter 3, you notice we started in verse 7. It says, likewise, ye husbands. So the husbands are specifically addressed, ways that we as husbands should conduct ourselves. But in verse number 1 of chapter 3, likewise, ye wives. And really 1 through 6 is an explanation to the wives. And sometimes wives will read 1 through 6, or husbands will read verse number 7, and our ego will flare up. I mean, wives will say, yeah, I know 1 Peter 3, and I know Ephesians 5, and I know these marriage passages tell me to be submissive. I think somebody wrote a book, I don't recollect who, but something like Me, Obey Him is the title of the book. And it's just alluding there in the title to the pride that sometimes creeps into the heart of a female. It's God's plan that I'm submissive to my husband, but... And then the opposite is true as well for men. We are called to be the leaders of our home, but before we can lead anybody else, we've got to make sure we lead ourselves well. Before we can lead others, we've got to follow Him well. Sometimes our pride, our ego gets way too big and out of control, and we expect, since we're the leader, we get that title, to be treated a certain way. I'm saying your ego is the enemy of a healthy marriage. Not only the world and the flesh, but as you continue to think about the enticements to the flesh, I'm saying that comparison is the enemy of a healthy marriage. More specifically, comparison is the enemy of fidelity. You want to be faithful. That's part of having a biblical marriage. It's the idea of fidelity. But sometimes people find discontentment in their marriage because they're busy comparing their marriage to the marriage of others. And they're seeing certain things in this person, this husband. The wife is seeing another husband conduct himself this way, and she thinks, I wish my husband would conduct himself that way. Or vice versa, a husband sees another wife and says, why doesn't my wife, conduct herself that way? And that couple is now discontent in their situation because they're comparing their relationship to another couple. What's interesting is you don't see that other couple behind closed doors, in the privacy of their own house. And so what often happens is comparison fosters this kind of discontentment, and I'm saying that discontentment is the enemy of happiness in marriage. You ought to study closely Philippians, I think it's chapter 4, where this emphasis on being content with such things as you have. And understanding that I think the 10th of 10 commandments concerning coveting, I mean, it's included there. This idea of longing for something or someone that is not yours and not entrusted to your care. It's unhealthy. It's fleshly is what I'm saying. So your flesh is the enemy of the harmony of your marriage, and it is on these levels and many more. And not only the world, the flesh, and the devil are our enemies, and not only the world and the flesh, but also the devil is one of our enemies. I like the phrase in Scripture, the wiles of the devil. I mean, the devil has lots of ways to try to undermine a healthy marriage. And remember that the devil wants you to be hooked on pornography. The devil wants you to be entangled with the world's ideologies. The devil wants you to fail in your marriage. So make sure you identify your enemies. Your spouse is not your enemy. The world, the flesh, and the devil are among your enemies, and they manifest themselves in a variety of ways. Not only this key, but secondly, the second key is embrace your role. Embrace your role in marriage. What I'm saying is, just very bluntly, do your job and stop trying to do your spouse's job. Every Christian who's been saved for a significant duration, you ought to know, especially some of you that have had extensive exposure to one of the greatest Bible colleges, I think, ever in human history. I mean, you have been under the shadow of a great school and of a healthy church. You know, you've been involved in these wonderful Christian organizations. You should know well the Bible's teaching about your role as a husband or as a wife. Know it, know what your Creator God says about how you should conduct yourself, and then embrace it. Do your job. And part of that is knowing something about your spouse. The text here tells us to husbands to dwell with your wives according to knowledge. Let me tell you something about your spouse. This is a biblical concept. I can unpack it more comprehensively after the service, but just to touch on it here briefly, and that is, whether your husband will admit it or not, ladies, the number one thing he requires is respect. He requires respect. And whether your wife will admit it or not, fellas, the number one thing she requires is love. And that's why in Ephesians 5 it says, husbands, love your wives. And that's why it says, wives, reverence your husbands. In group settings like this, not at our church, but in other settings, I've had people bow their head and close their eyes. And I have said to the group, if you can only pick one, you want either respect or you want love. You can only have one. Nobody looking around. Raise your hand. Most of the time, it's 85-90% of the men say, I want respect. And then same percentage, similarly, women saying, I want love. If I have to only pick the one. And the reason that so many people identify that way is because that's how God has wired us. Your wife needs respect, sure. And your husband needs love. I mean, we need both of them. But the primary thing the husband needs is respect. And the primary thing the wife needs is love. Now, the love language book, Chapman's book, is helpful at figuring out what the love language of your spouse is. It was a good 20 years in. We've been married 24 years, Britt and I. It took me about 20 years to figure out the love language. But, I was trying. At some point, she told me. At some point, somebody gave us a copy of that book, and we were thumbing through it. And she's like, yeah, this one's mine. And I was like, really? And so you kind of work through that. But embrace your role, okay? And by the way, this idea of men requiring respect and women requiring love, because that's the way God made us, that is something for your spouse to know about you, but that's not something for you to expect from your spouse. So think about that with me for just a minute. So fellas, don't go home and now start expecting your wife to respect you, okay? Or ladies, don't go home and be like, yeah, he's been pretty unloving, and now pastor preached on it, old Oswald over here better start loving me the right way, Listen, it's something that we need to be reminded of, but it's unwise for you to now start expecting it, because you only set yourself up for future disappointment in your relationship. So you're aware of it, and you do your best to minister to your spouse in the things that you're aware of about them, but don't have an entitlement kind of mentality. Be careful about these high standards and these expectations that only eventually produce conflict. All right, here's the third idea, the third key for a happy marriage in a hostile world, and that is value peace. Value peace, and that also is here in our text. Now, what's interesting is I had you read verse 7 through 12, and when you get out of 7, really 1 through 7 of 1 Peter 3 is primarily husband and wife conduct. As you get into verse number 8 and following, it's talking about the people of God conduct, the church at large and the way that they conduct themselves. And we know that because verse number 8 talks about loving as brethren. But what is interesting is this content here, certainly it describes the church, but no doubt the way that the church at large should conduct themselves is also the way that an individual couple should conduct themselves. And the idea of peace is mentioned. It was mentioned in our responsive scripture reading. Let him seek peace in verse number 11. And I'm saying value peace even in your marriage. A peaceful marriage, again, is a part of our evangelism. And somebody says, yeah, Pastor Johnson, there'd be peace in my marriage if my wife would stop chirping at me all the time, or if my husband would just do this or solve that or stop that, then there would be peace. What I'm saying is peace is extremely valuable, and it's up to you to maintain it. So how do you maintain it? There should be numerous times in the life of a married couple where now I'm going to say something that's antithetical to the world's ideologies, but here goes nonetheless. In order to maintain peace, you will deny yourself numerous times for the sake of peace. It could be numerous times in a single day, numerous times over the week, whatever. You deny yourself for the sake of peace. And what I mean by that, in a real specific, practical way, is that you say less. This idea that, well, now I've got a wife and I've been married all these decades, and so I've got a person now that I can just literally say anything I want to, and they're still going to love me. That's really not the best strategy in marriage. It's really not, okay? Now, yeah, in theory it's true, but what I'm trying to say is that sometimes you're venting and you're going to upset the peace by saying something ignorant, something that may be explosive. There have been times, just full transparency, that I look back on, Britton, and I'm just confessing to you right now, okay, that I know had I not said that one phrase, there would have been peace. And after I said that phrase, there was no peace, okay? There was no peace. I'm saying value peace to the point that you try to maintain it, which means you deny, I could say this, and she's promised to love me anyways. We watched our wedding video maybe a year or two ago. We pulled out that VHS, we carried it into the, and we watched, and we did the traditional wedding vows, and we pledged those things one to another. So she has to keep her word, and I can just let my hair down and say anything and do anything and be anything, and no, nonsense. Say less. If you're saying, if saying some specific thing unnecessarily interrupts the peace of your relationship, I'm suggesting that you don't say it and that you value peace over the thing you wanted to say. Not only these things, but here's this one. Know when to interrupt the peace. There are times to interrupt the peace. Now, value peace and say less so that you can maintain peace, but every once in a while, there are some things worth fighting for. And veterans of marriage among us, and there are some that have been married 55, I think close to 60 years. Anybody more than 55 years, would you raise your hand? All right, okay, I know I was pointing in the right direction here. Hicks, how long have you been married? Praise the Lord. And Ogles? Oh, you're young married. Oh, 57. Give these folks a round of applause. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, veterans of marriage can probably tell you that listen, there's a wonderful value in peace, but there are some things worth putting your foot down over. There are some things worth identifying. Now, here's our problem, though, is that we're interrupting the peace over dumb stuff, okay? More often than not, as I deal with people in marriage counseling and in our own relationship, people will put their foot down. They'll take exception. Oh, you said that, and you did this, and you didn't do that, and I thought you were going to do, and I just can't believe, and didn't I say this, and I texted you, and you didn't even, and on it goes, and they take exception. The peace is interrupted over silly stuff. Listen, it's all about love, right? That's what the foundation of marriage is. You pledged your love. You remember the first time you said, I love you to your spouse, very likely. Remember that love covers a multitude of sins. I mean, way less often should we be putting our foot down and taking exception. And if we value peace, we'll understand, there are some things worth fighting for, but so many of the things you end up fighting for are not worth fighting for. And peace is far more valuable. And one way to discern what is put your foot down worthy is to saturate yourself with this book. And so do that, and you'll be able to navigate those times. Avoid blowing things out of proportion so that you can maintain the peace of your marriage. Try to be a fire extinguisher and stop being a fire starter. When things get brewing just a little bit, there are things you can say that'll just calm everything. Instead of things get brewing just a little bit, your pride gets flared up, and all of a sudden you've got a house afire. So value peace. All right, here's number 4. Number 4 is plan to forgive. Plan to forgive. This idea I alluded to already from Ephesians 5, Christ and His church, and Christ and His bride, the church. I mean, our whole relationship with the head of the church, He's the one who is to have preeminence in the church. Our whole relationship is based on forgiveness. We have no relationship with God if it's not for the forgiveness that's offered through Christ. And if you're gonna make it to 57 or 60 years or these decades that people have been married, if you're going to make it, you're going to have to learn how to forgive. And a call to forgive is not necessarily a call to forget. The truth is, there are sometimes people say stuff, people do stuff, that for whatever reason you can never forget. But you have got to find a way to forgive. And you should pray and say, God, I want to forgive so thoroughly, would you enable me to forget? Because maybe the Lord will take that away from you. But if you're a forgiver and you're praying that you could be a forgetter, then you won't be holding grudges. You won't be bringing up nonsense from decades ago. You won't be ripping open old wounds. No, you're a forgiver. You appreciate so much the forgiveness that Christ has offered to you, you old sinner. And so you want to offer forgiveness to that sinner you happen to be married to. I mean, that's the point of Ephesians 4:32. Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Just like He forgave me of my sins, I should forgive my spouse. And just like He forgave her of her sins, she should forgive her spouse. And that is a healthy approach when it comes to marriage. And sometimes there's conflict in marriage, and the conflict is reoccurring, and it just doesn't seem like you're able to really get to where you want to be in marriage. And it almost as if you're not in love anymore. And because you've been through some stuff, and there's been lots of fire starters and very little fire extinguishers, and you've had several houses on fire, and you're at a point where you feel like it's a loveless marriage. And what I'm saying is the best way to rekindle that love is to go back to the beginning, to figure out, to revisit those times where you fell in love one with another. Go back to the beginning, and I'm going to say this in the hearing of some of you that are at the beginning. Go back to the beginning when everything was easy, okay? Some of you say, it ain't easy, I'm at the beginning, this is difficult. Well, it gets more difficult, okay? But anyhow, yeah, because in the beginning, the idea of love is blind, but marriage is the eye-opener. You've heard that before, okay? Go back to when you were just enchanted with one another, that period of your life where your spouse could do no wrong. It was about 3 weeks, right? They just couldn't do anything, and you were just enchanted. If you're in a loveless situation, it'd be helpful for you to go back to what originally attracted the two of you together. And the prayer ought to be that both of you would say, hey, we recognize where we are, but we both have got to do these 4 things. We both have got to get back to where we were in the beginning. We both got to identify our enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil, and protect the happiness, the potential happiness in our marriage. We both have got to embrace our roles. Both of us have got to value peace and stop interrupting it for nonsense. And both of us have got have to have a plan to forgive. Let me say a few more things here, and I'll be done. But I want to say that I mentioned saying less, valuing peace and saying less. But saying less does not mean just saying, okay, well, I'm not going to talk about it even though there's still an issue there. If you're pursuing harmony and happiness, you've got to address the issues. You have got to, my wife and I, when we've had conflict, she'll tell me, I can't sleep if there's conflict between us. And I'll say, go to bed. No, I would never say no. She'll say, and her point is, how can we just continue to go through the motions if there's something on her heart or something on my heart? That's the idea in Ephesians 4 about not letting the sun go down upon your wrath. Now listen, there are some things, and here we're talking about forgiving. I mean, there are some things that you should be able to compartmentalize. You don't have to have a big, long conversation about every little thing. Sometimes ladies, more typically, will be more emotional and they want some kind of comprehensive explanation about the ins and outs of the whole thing. And in reality, maybe if you're more the emotional one in the relationship, what you need to do is apply that charity covers a multitude of sins. And you on your own need to be able to get over it. Now, I'm not talking about sweeping it under the rug and the rug just builds a bigger mound, I mean, it's still there. Don't just hide it under the rug. I'm saying figure out a way to recognize your sinful propensity. My spouse just sinned against me, and so I am going to recognize God's grace on my life, and I'm going to forgive them. I'm not just sweeping it under the rug. I'm just going to completely forgive them without a big bunch of conversation. But if there is conflict there, and the spouse just isn't over it, you address it because you love them. And as I've said before, you value peace. And so it's not just go through the motions. It is love them enough to address their needs, but at the same time, love your spouse enough to try to be a forgiver and a comprehensive forgiver to the point that you remove it as far as the east is from the west. And so these are things I think that can foster a happy marriage in the midst of a hostile world. Listen, the world needs to see happy homes. I mean, we tell them we love Jesus, and that He's the center, the foundation of everything we are building. And so for His sake, and for the sake of the harmony of your home, reflect Christ well. Go ahead and stand with me, please, if you would.